So today I will be presenting on finding Jesus across Scripture. And so let's take a quick look at what I'll be covering today. I want to focus on Jesus in the Old Testament, the people, the prophecies, as well as 15 reasons why we should read the Old Testament. Moving forward, I want to look a little bit on the theme of redemption and cover that. And then I also want to look up the mission of God. That's both for us and the mission that he had from the very, very beginning. So let's take a quick look at the Old Testament. So the Old Testament shows the people of God. It is the starting act. It shows where it started, and it gives us a lot of understanding for what we know today from church. Really, it just shows God's plan for his people. And again, that all starts and is revealed in the Old Testament. The Old Testament also has a lot of prophecies. There are many prophecies from the Messiah, also called the Son of Man, Emmanuel, and others. All of these refer to Jesus. These were known by many Hebrews, and for a lot, it was the way that the early church proved that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. Furthermore, today, knowing these prophecies helps us better in apologetics and pointing to the Messiah as well. And these are just a couple scripture references that pull up several of the prophecies of Jesus in the Old Testament. So let's look at 15 reasons why we should read the Old Testament. Well, reason number one, the Old Testament, like I said earlier, it reveals Jesus. It prepared the church for Jesus and the fullness of himself. Everything from the revealing of salvation and redemption, these are characteristics you find all throughout the Old Testament. Reason two, it helps us understand the New Testament. So you got to understand the Old Testament in a lot of ways is a prelude to the New Testament. By only reading the New Testament, you're not getting the whole story, which is why it's good to read the Old Testament. Number three, it saves sinners. The scriptures make you wise unto salvation. This was something Paul spoke about. And oftentimes the scriptures they refer to are those in the Old Testament. Reason four, it's a manual for living. This shows us lots of the ways that we can have a good relationship with God. Number five, it presets doctrine in story form. And so, really, this helps us understand good doctrine and scriptural living and living action. And so, it also comforts and encourages us. It was Jesus's Bible. This is huge. This is very, very huge. Jesus often spoke the scriptures, and they were often those from the Old Testament that he portrayed in the New Testament. Also, it displays all that God was capable of throughout the Old Testament, his grace and more. It shows the bigger picture of redemption. It strengthens our apologetics. Again, those prophecies and things like that. It explains our culture. So this is just a little bit for the church. Reading the Old Testament explains a lot of how the early church was and why they were that way. Reason 12, it also gives us hope. There's so many difficult times in the Old Testament where yet they had hope because of all the stories and all the things. We can actually take that and use that today when we go through difficult times. Moving on, it makes sense of our story. You see, our story cannot be understood without the story of God because our story is built from him. It also warms our heart. And then lastly, it helps us appreciate the New Testament more. That long deepness and waiting is fulfilled in the New Testament. And so reading the Old Testament and seeing that anguish, the longing, the frustration makes the New Testament so much more valuable in our eyes. A little bit something that I want to touch on is the theme of redemption. You see, I want to read a quick definition. It means to secure the release or recovery of persons or things by the payment of a price. Redemption from our sin. You see, that payment had to be made, and Jesus was the lamb and the final payment. And so from start to finish, you can actually see redemption from sin and reconciliation with God from all over the Bible, literally from start to finish. You see, God redeemed his people over and over in the Old Testament. God redeemed his people, even those who were not necessarily from the Hebrew tribe. they still followed him, and so God redeemed them. Just look at Ruth and Rahab and several others. Also, moving forward for the Old Testament, a couple things I want to hit on is Exodus 12:21 through 27. This is the first Passover, and this shows the innocent blood. Leviticus shows us the sacrificial needs made by the innocent lambs. But Isaiah 53 is my favorite scripture throughout all of the Bible, and it portrays so accurately the coming Christ and what he would suffer as the lamb. Also, the mission. God's big mission was to bring redemption. And because God created the space for redemption, our mission now is to share Christ with others. And that's just Romans 10:14 and Mark 16:15. You can see a little bit of that. And so to hit on it, Jesus is a part of the story from the beginning to the end of Scripture. That's what we need to focus on.